Good evening and a very warm welcome on behalf of Milim to this evening's presentation. Welcome wherever you are in the UK and indeed wherever you are in the world. Our series of online talks and conversations continues with our guest Peter Bradley, and I'll introduce Peter in just a moment. A little housekeeping first. Please do ask questions. This is possible by typing whatever you'd like to ask into the Q&A facility on your screen, and as ever we'll try to get through as many of your questions as we can. Let me also draw your attention to the chat facility. This allows you to send a message to all of the other participants on this webinar should you wish to do so. And finally, we are recording this event and you'll find it on the Milim website at milim.org.uk in the next few days. You'll find details of our future program there, as well as recordings of other past events which you can watch. You can also book tickets for our program there if you wish. Now to our guest this evening. Peter Bradley was born in Erdington, Birmingham, and he was the Labour MP for Wrekin between 1997 and 2005. Before entering Parliament, he ran his own public affairs company, prior to which he worked in PR and for a think tank. More recently, Peter co-founded and directed the Speaker's Corner Trust, a charity which promotes freedom of expression, open debate and active citizenship in the UK and in developing democracies. He's written for a wide range of publications, including The Times, The Independent and The Guardian. And Peter is also author of this book, The Last Train, A Family History of the Final Solution, which was published in May this year and which we will now talk about. Peter, a very warm welcome to you.
Hello.
So was there something specific that inspired you to write this book?
Well, yes. Very strangely, when I was an MP, I had, as most MPs, I saw many MPs have a column in the local newspaper. And in January 2005, I wrote an article to mark Holocaust Memorial Day. It was based on a letter, the copy of a letter that my father had written his parents when he first arrived in this country in May 1939. And that copy was appended to a brief family history that he'd written in later life. So I wrote this 700-800 word article, and it was published in the local newspaper, and I kind of forgot about it, but it came back in a sense to almost to haunt me for the next 10 years. I kept thinking about this article and the unfinished business it had started, and in particular there was an image which I'd conjured up in the article, the image of two trains. One which bore my father west to freedom on the 10th of May 1939, the other which headed east to Latvia, carrying my grandparents, and of course they didn't return from Latvia. It was that image of the two trains that stayed with me for the best part of a decade. And finally, I conceived this idea. I can't really explain it. This idea, this compulsion to follow the route of the train that deported my grandparents. And so I began, I guess, around about 2015 to try to research the route of that train, which was special train Sonda 32, DA 32. But ironically, I never did find out the route it took. If there were records, then they probably didn't mean a great deal, because that train would have been diverted so many times between Nuremberg and Riga as it shunted into sidings to allow freight trains and troop trains and mission trains to rush backwards and forwards to the Eastern Front, new Eastern Front. So I never did discover the answer to that question, the question about the route, but that question led to many others, and those are the questions I try to answer in the book.
So the book is a family history, but it's a lot more than that too, indeed more than you've alluded to in the last minute or so. How did you actually approach telling the story?
It was a, you know, I think I've kind of, as I've described it, almost an accidental book, in the way that it began to dawn on me, this need to start thinking and ultimately to start writing about my family history. And that's how it started out, as actually a family history, but it developed layer after layer as I tried to answer the questions that kept cropping up. As I mentioned, I started with this very simple question about the route of a train. But as I traced questions back, they all ended up with one fundamental question. Why did my grandparents' neighbors, their former friends, the people they did business with, people who shopped at their draper's store, why did those people put my grandparents on that train? And so I tried to use my family story, which dates back, according to records, the late 15th century on my mother's side and the 17th century on my father's side. I tried to use what we know about members of our family and what I was able to find out through research. I tried to make my family story a prism into a much broader and longer history. I tried to understand how that ancient hatred of anti-Semitism, which shaped the lives of my family, and indeed, of course, of families of most Jews in Europe for century after century, millennium after millennium. I tried to understand where it and how it arose and what impact it had on the family. But I also tried to shine a light, I guess, on those theaters of the genocide, Holocaust, which are relatively little known about. Everybody knows, of course, about the death camps, about Auschwitz, Belsen. Far fewer people know about the killing fields in Russia and the Baltic states, and the fate of Jews who were deported from Germany, from Austria, from Czechoslovakia, from Hungary to Latvia and elsewhere. And so I tried to shine a light on that little known. Finally, I wanted to challenge the way we think. When I say we, I mean British people, American people in general, the way we think about our own role in the events, historical events in terms of relations with Jews, but also our role in the fate of Jews in the 30s and 40s. So it is multi-layered, and it was quite a job to knit it all together. I hope I've succeeded, but I wanted it to be more than just a story about my family, which I felt like in the end be a little bit self-indulgent. I wanted to make it mean a great deal more and ask and answer more questions than the ones that go to most of us about, you know, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, and so on.
No, I think you've certainly succeeded. The history is very rich, and your family's story really provides the context for what you're talking about. I was going to ask, in the past, you've written for publications such as the ones I mentioned. How was it different to write a work at this scale? Is that something you'd done before, or is this the first time?
No, this is the first time I've attempted a book. As I mentioned, I was a kind of accidental author, and more often than not, in the articles I've written for newspapers, they're accidental too. It starts with an idea in my head, and the feeling that I have almost a compulsion to try and think through this idea, to look around from every angle from all sides, and then to try to establish what I think about it. And I do it really for my own sense of fulfillment, and indeed as a means of thinking more deeply about issues that arise from day to day. And then I set out to write down, to formalize the way I think about it. And then I think, well, spent a lot of time and a lot of effort and energy on this. I'm kind of pleased with the conclusions I've reached. Maybe other people might be interested in reading it. And at that point, you know, maybe I talk to the newspaper and say, are you interested in this? And that's really the way that articles I've written for the press have generally been generated. And actually, that's how the book came about. I didn't set out to write a book for publication, but by the time I'd finished it and edited it and revised it extensively and over a long period of time, by the time I'd finished that process, I thought, well, you know, it'd be a shame if nobody else would be interested in it. And you know, I have an extraordinarily strong admiration for those columnists on major newspapers who get a brief at, you know, tea time on Monday, and on Tuesday morning their articles are in the paper. I'm simply not able to do that. I have to sit and cogitate and digest and revise and edit till finally, probably after the event has passed and everybody else has moved on to another subject, I'm happy with what I've written.
Now, your introduction to the book says, for my parents who did not speak of these things, for my grandparents who could not, and for our children who must, for you. Very powerful introduction. Your parents didn't speak of these things. At what point did you become aware of the history, and what impact did that have on you when you discovered it?
I think that my sister and my slightly elder sister, we may have been aware from a relatively young age that there was something about our parents that wasn't quite the same as the parents of our friend. We wouldn't have understood why. It was only probably when I was about 10, 11 that, you know, sniffing through the drawers of a bureau in our home when our parents were out, I came across a document that suggested that my father's name had not always been the one with which I was familiar. There was a document with the name Fritz Brandes on it, and I didn't know what it was. I can't remember now whether I ever saw it again. But this was very perplexing. I was a kind of imaginative child. I was very much interested in mythology and history, and this became another kind of mythology for me, but one closer to home. But it wasn't one that I could easily unravel, because I didn't know the questions I should be asking, and I wasn't sure that my parents wanted to answer them anyway. So it was a slightly uneasy feeling, but also there was a kind of certain romance to it, that being different, feeling that you're different, is sometimes nerving, but sometimes also it can be kind of exciting. But it was perplexing. My parents didn't speak about these things. They did speak German at the dinner table, but only until the age when my sister and I began to understand some of what they were saying, and then it just stopped. And they were very clear that in later life, when we discussed these things, they didn't want us to learn German. They didn't want us to be confused about our heritage. They had left behind their childhood, their adolescence, their young adult. They had started again in England, in Britain, and they wanted us to feel as English and as British as the friends we went to school with. They didn't want us to be burdened. They didn't want us to be confused. And so I think for those understandable reasons, they didn't talk about things. But of course, there were also very difficult things for them to talk about. They had put them behind them by that stage, and didn't really want to revisit.
Did you pick up the German from them? Are you able to speak German as a result of that?
I speak very rusty German. I'm ashamed to say. I have a natural sympathy for German. I think I know a lot of people think it's an unattractive language. I find it very resonant, a very attractive language. But I am very rusty. I think if I were to spend a considerable amount of time in Germany, I'd pick it up again. But as I say, I'm fairly ashamed that, having just been to Germany a few weeks ago, I was very happy that most people I was talking to were speaking in English.
So, your father's family. Let's talk a little bit about the history that you've covered. What can you share with us about your father's story?
Well, my father's family, his father's family came from Hesse in what was Prussia. Been there for several centuries. In fact, I've got a photograph of my grandfather as a young man with splendid Prussian moustaches. You know, rather similar to the Kaisers, and indeed he served in the First World War in Belgium. And was decorated for his service. But his family had a business in a small town, Rotenburg under Fulda. Had a drapery business. His father did. But Sally, that's my grandfather, Sally Brandes, moved to Bamberg as a young man. He married a young woman from Bayreuth, which is quite close to Bamberg, from another family, fairly prosperous family of textile merchants and drapers. And with the dowry that he was awarded when they got married, they set up their first business in Bamberg, and it was very successful. And he did well. He went off to war. My father was born. He came back from war. His business prospered. He survived the recession crash in the late 20s better than most middle class Germans, because most of his money was invested in his business and in property. Well, actually not in property, but in his business. So he was a middle class German Jew. Whether he would have described himself as a German Jew or a Jewish German, I don't know. I think he probably felt 50-50. 50% of his friends were non-Jewish, 50% were Jewish. He was chairman of the synagogue choir. He was kind of observant of the high holy days, but no more than that. Bertha, his wife, my grandmother, was less observant. But they were just a very normal family. But it had some very interesting antecedents. Gluckel von Hameln, I don't know whether your listeners, your viewers know who Gluckel von Hameln was, but she was a remarkable woman who, term of the 17th, 18th century, wrote a diary of her life as a quite successful and then not so successful businesswoman, which in those years was pretty unusual. And actually to have written her own diary, which survives to this day, was equally unusual. there was Gluckel from Hummel, there was Heinrich Heine, the great romantic poet of the early 19th century, and there were others whose lives and whose experiences as Jews and Germans, as I mentioned in an earlier answer, really helped illuminate the experience of Jews century by century.
And what about your mother's family? Was your mother, I believe, escaped Germany prior to the Second World War?
Yes, she did. My mother's family was called Zunz, Z-U-N-Z. They came originally from a small town not so far from Düsseldorf called Zons, Z-O-N-Z, Z-O-N-S, Zons am Rhein, although ironically not on the Rhine anymore. It was a customs post on the Rhine. The Rhine flowed past it, which made it a good place for a customs post, and it became quite prosperous, whereupon the Rhine retreated a couple of hundred meters, and so it's now a bit maroon, but a very small and attractive town. But it was also a town that was on the front line between kind of wars between princes, and must have been quite an uncomfortable place to be living when it was full of rapacious mercenaries. So that might have prompted the patriarch of the family, a man by the name of Pesach, to migrate to Frankfurt at the end of the 15th century. And he became one of the very first residents of the Frankfurt ghetto, which actually was the first ghetto in Europe, even predating the Venice ghetto. There, the Zunz family lived from the inception of the ghetto, 20 years or so after it was first opened in the 60s. They lived there from then until it was finally dissolved at the beginning of the 19th century. So something like 13, 15 generations of my mother's family experienced life, one generation after the other in the ghetto. She was lucky. She was fortunate. She and my uncle were fortunate in the mid-30s and 36 to be able to escape to Britain, and that was for a quirky reason. At the end of the 19th century, her grandmother decided that on the death of her husband that she had too many children to look after on her own, and so she offered one to a childless family of relatives in London. And so my great aunt Mari, at the very tender age of 13 or 14, the very impressionable age of 13 or 14, was cut loose from her own family and shipped off to England. But she survived. She married a stockbroker, a very wealthy man, and it was through that kind of very sad, I suppose, a sense of abandonment must have had, that she settled in England and was wealthy enough in mid-30s to be able to sponsor her sister, that's my maternal grandmother, and her children and husband, and so the whole family was able to emigrate to London in 36.
Now you're quite fortunate, I suppose, in being able to trace your family back quite so far. Most people, I think, don't have that luxury. You write about the Enlightenment. Indeed, you can trace your family history to long before that. But what were you able to learn about how that period of time changed things for your family? Because suddenly Jews were able to do things that they weren't able to do before.
Yes, although I mentioned that part of the purpose of my book is to challenge orthodox thinking about a number of issues, including actually the legacy of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment had its dark sides, it had its shadows. If you think, for example, of Voltaire, the king of the 18th century philosophy, guiding light, if you like, of the Enlightenment. The man was a rampant anti-Semite, and so indeed was some of the other great, the Enlightenment and indeed the Reform movement in Britain and elsewhere. And it was around about that time that the intellectual shift began to occur between a fundamentally Christian view of Jews as those who had murdered Christ and deserved to be punished for this deicide. So people who could be persecuted on religious grounds, but actually who did have at least the opportunity to escape through, for example, conversion, although that was never a fail-safe method. And in the case of Hein China, he did convert to Christianity, but only as he anticipated, in order to gain access to the highest cultural circles of his age. He very soon discovered that he was still considered to be a recalcitrant Jew, and he was still shunned, spurned. Indeed, you know, a century later was Gustav Mahler, who'd also converted and found that that wasn't good enough, even in a secular age. But it is the case that the Enlightenment also gave rise to revolution, and as Napoleon's armies moved across Europe, so a certain amount of enfranchisement for Jews in those occupied territories was introduced. But of course, as Bonaparte's armies then retreated, did those rights. So as my family and the Jewish communities of Europe and Germany in particular entered the 19th century, there was a faltering advance towards citizens' rights, towards enfranchisement. But it was faltering. It was 2 steps forward and sometimes 1 back and sometimes 3 back, until the unification of Germany in 1871 did introduce rights, equal rights for Jewish citizens. That doesn't necessarily mean that they were welcomed or treated as equals in every tier of society, but it did give them opportunities they hadn't had before. On my mother's side, there was my great-great-grandfather, David Adolfson, who kept a diary in the fateful year of 1847, 1848, when he was 17, the year of revolutions across Europe, and he recounts the tumultuous events that were taking place in Europe. The final entry is him sheltering behind a barricade as the musket fired over the top. But he went on to become a successful banker. He was a member of several learned societies. He was, you know, probably quite a big noise in the Jewish community of Frankfurt, but also in the general community. So he would have been prospering. He was prospering, and he was looking forward to, with great optimism, for the 20th century. But of course, history didn't smile so much on his grandchildren, one of whom was my grandfather. As I said, he was forced to emigrate in the 30s. His brother perished in Auschwitz. Similarly, a forebear of my father on my father's side, Jakob Hertz, was an academic in the University of Erlangen in Bavaria. And after many difficulties and many obstacles placed in the way of this quite brilliant man, he finally became the first Jewish professor in Bavaria, and ultimately the first Jew in Germany to have a statue raised. It was raised after his death in 1875 by public subscription. He was such a figure in his hometown of Erlangen, so beloved, particularly of poorer people to whom he provided medical assistance for free, that the public themselves paid for the statue to be raised in the main square in Erlangen. And just 6 years later, their grandchildren tore it down in 1933. They wasted precious little time to tear it down because it was seen to be a disgrace, a scar on the beautiful face of Nazi Erlangen. So that golden period that I suppose was ushered in initially by the Enlightenment, that golden period didn't really arrive until the second half of the 19th century, and then it was really little more than a couple of generations.
Which brings us really to the First World War, which led to huge upheaval in Germany, particularly because the country was defeated in the war. How did this impact on your ancestors? Were you able to learn about what happened to them around that time?
Well, my my paternal grandfather, as I mentioned, he had quite a successful business in Bamberg. He was mentioned quite senior figure in the Jewish community. I mentioned he was the chairman of the synagogue choir, and at the end of the 30s, he became the vice chairman of the community itself. He was also a member of the Odd Fellows, Chamber of Commerce, and so on and so forth. So he had done pretty well from the time that he came to Bamberg in 1913 to more or less the time of the Nazis. My maternal grandfather had a rather different experience. He was a pretty poor businessman, to be honest. He was also in draperies and textiles. He had two businesses. I think through his lack of business sense and the maneuverings of some of his partners, became unsustainable, to the point that when the Great Depression, Germany, and inflation started to spiral, he was forced on occasion to go to the soup kitchens, as indeed did many other Germans of the day, to feed his family. So I think he, in common with many Germans at that time, found life extremely challenging. But they had come from a fairly wealthy background. They had vineyards in a beautiful town called Bad Dürkheim, and had, prospered at the end of the 19th century. But they found life increasingly difficult in the 20s, and of course then in the 30s.
Worse is yet to come, and the rise of the Nazis is well documented, and indeed well documented in your book. How did your father manage to escape?
Well, he said that he didn't know. He was arrested, as was my grandfather, after Kristallnacht. My grandfather was sent to Dachau, and he was released a month later, but only in order to sell, to sign the papers that sold at bottom price the business that he had developed with his wife Beata over the last 25 years. He sold it incidentally to a member of the Nazi Party. It's on the main square in Grüner Markt in Bamberg. He had been evicted from his previous business premises on one side of Grüner Markt at the beginning of 1938, and I suppose it's quite telling that he thought, I'm not going to be at other people's beck and call. I'm not going to place myself at risk again. I'm not going to become a tenant. I'm going to own my own property. This was an extremely short-sighted view of the take of the Nazis, but he, like many other Jews of his generation, simply could not bring himself to believe that the Nazis meant what they were saying about the Jews. He bought his own premises on Grüner Markt. Ironically, when he was forced to sell them to the member of the Nazi Party, Bamberg was not a city that was badly bombed in the Second World War, but one bomb did fall, and it fell on that property premises, with the man who had taken over his business inside, and that was the end of him. But my father was arrested in Frankfurt, and he was sent to Buchenwald. He spent 5 months there, and I can't imagine the horror of those 5 months. Buchenwald was a dreadful place to be, and that was something my father spoke almost nothing about. But it made a great impression on him, I think influenced the way he conducted the rest of his life. He said that it taught him never to be the first and never to be the last in any endeavor, but always to be, as anonymous as possible in the middle. And he's not the only one who made that observation about life in concentration camps. But he was released in April 1939 because a Jewish charity in London had arranged sponsorship for him. Now, he says, as I mentioned, he doesn't know who it was or why it was that his name was picked out of the hat. But he was released in April, and in May he was able to board a train at Frankfurt South railway station and head to Vlissingen, Flushing, Dutch coast, and thence to Harwich and London.
And of course, not long after he'd arrived here, he was interned, as many refugees from Germany were. Did he ever speak about this?
Relatively little. He, when my mother, he died, my father died in 2004, my mother died in 2010. And when my sister was clearing out our old family home, she found under the cupboard under the stairs an old trunk, which she gave to me, and I didn't open it for several years. But in it, I found some 700 letters that my mother and father had exchanged when he was serving in the British Army. Almost like emails. It was almost a daily exchange of letters, an absolutely fascinating insight into their experiences in those very uncertain days. There were also 36 letters received from his parents when he was in England and later when he was interned in Canada. And on the top of it was a copy of the News Chronicle, which some of your older viewers may remember as a newspaper, and it was folded open onto page 7. There was a report of a queue forming outside a recruitment station, army recruitment station, in October 1939, shortly after the outbreak of war. It describes a young German who had just escaped the camps, who was very keen to enlist in the British Army. And of course, that individual, though he wasn't named, was clearly my father. Well, obviously, his attempt to enlist with the Luft, his background wasn't trustworthy. And indeed, in 1940, in May 1940, as the Germans advanced into France and the Low Countries, and the British, perhaps understandably, took fright, he and thousands of others, Germans, Austrians, Italians, were rounded up in England, in Britain, and sent to camps. Many of them on the Isle of Man. Both my father and my uncle spent time on the Isle of Man. The government kind of began to realize that this was a little bit over the top and started releasing quite a few of those Jews that it considered to be less of a risk. But they'd already concluded agreements with the governments of Canada and Australia that they would send them some dangerous Nazis and prisoners of war to look after. And when they discovered that actually most of the people they'd rounded up weren't dangerous, they certainly weren't Nazis, and they weren't prisoners of war either. But by the time they kind of figured that out, they were too embarrassed to tell the Canadians and the Australians that they'd changed their minds. And so my father and my uncle were put on on a ship called the Ettrick, sailed the day after the Arandora Star, carrying a similar cargo of so-called enemy aliens, was blown up mid-Atlantic by a torpedo with terrible loss of life. But the very next day, my father followed the Arandora Star on the SS Ettrick and spent the next 2 years in a camp, internment camp in Canada. So he didn't speak much about it. It must have been extremely frustrating. Nobody wants to be a prisoner. At least they perhaps felt safer in Canada than they might have been with the threat of the Nazi invasion of Britain. But they were cooped up with Nazis, with prisoners of war. The Canadians didn't distinguish between them. They were all Germans as far as they were concerned. So it was not a pleasant experience. And after 2 years, he was finally allowed to return to England and allowed to join the army.
Now, you describe how your father rejected his Judaism because of his experiences, I suppose. Yet when he met your mother and they subsequently married, they had a civil ceremony, but they also had a religious one. And it seems somewhat out of character in terms of how you've described him. Why do you think they did that? Yes,
I mentioned that his family was observant of the High Holy Days, but not much more. But actually, interestingly, in that trunk, alongside the letters and the News Chronicle, there were also his tallis and his holy books. He had brought them with him to Germany. But he had said that what little religion he had suffered kind of pretty fatal blows. First, cult, and then when he returned to Bamberg after his release and saw the smouldering ruins of the great synagogue of Bamberg, and he said something in him snapped. He felt that if there was a God, he was not smiling on the Jews who were suffering terrible persecution. He never returned to his religion. He was a rationalist as well. I mean, by nature, he was a humanist, but he had little time for organized religion. And yet he did get married, first at the registry office, and then, as you say, he was married by former rabbi of Bamberg, Max Hutton, who had also escaped to London. He said in the short history that he wrote, he did it out of a sense of continuity. And because he felt a great affection for Bamberg, even in those days. And he wanted a link with that part. It was an affection that for the city in which he was born and in which he grew up, that he sustained for the rest of his life. But I think he felt it important to have some link at a time when he felt particularly insecure and rootless with the past with which he was familiar.
Of course, your father got out, but your grandparents remained in Germany. So you write extensively about their experiences. Time is not on our side, unfortunately, this evening, but can you briefly explain something of their fate?
Yes, I think they lived, as so many other Jews of their generations did, because the younger generation of Jews in Germany were much better able to see the writing on the wall. They had perhaps the vision, but also the resources to tackle the Byzantine migration or emigration processes in the mid to late 30s, and also they offered some kind of economic value to those countries, those few countries who were prepared to take them. My grandparents' generation, my grandfather, as I said, served in the First World War. He couldn't believe that the Nazis meant what they said. And so there was this constant balance between hope and apprehension, hope again, and then hope against hope, and then finally desperation when they realized that the that the Nazis were going to follow through, were highly likely to follow through their threats. Their lives became ever more circumscribed until they not only lost their businesses, they lost their homes, they lost their possessions, assets, they lost their citizenship, their identity. In the end, my grandfather was forced to sweep the streets and dig the roads of the city in which he had been a proud member of the community. And in November 1941, they were rounded up, marched from their homes to the station in Bamberg, thence to rally grounds in Nuremberg, where the great Nazi rallies had taken place. They were spent 2 nights in the barracks there, and then put on a train from Nuremberg to Riga. That was the transport route which I had hoped to follow. There was still, I think, those who hoped, maybe my grandparents were among them, that had hoped that, you know, the propaganda that they were being fed, the lies they were being fed, that they were going out to populate some corner of the new German Reich, and that, you know, when they'd made a success of it and had served their Führer, maybe they'd be allowed home. They clung to the hope that they might still survive and, you know, maybe even prosper. But of course, it was an illusion. My grandmother and grandfather ended up at a camp called Jungfernhof outside Riga. Very shortly after they arrived, my grandfather was marched through the snow to a clearing in the woods where he had to, with other Jews, to build a new camp. That was the last he saw of his wife Beata, because in March 1942, she and other 1,700 other inmates of Jungfernhof were told that they were going to be moved to a new camp, a place called Buenemunde, a fish cannery, where conditions would be so much better. They'd have work, they'd have food, they'd have better accommodation and warmer clothing. And they were driven by bus to a forest, mowed down by machine gun into the mass graves. My grandfather survived for at least another 18 months before I lost track of him. My father knew that he'd been a slave laborer on the railways in Latvia, and I subsequently discovered that he'd been working in the peat fields as well, in freezing conditions, digging German war. And then the trail goes on. I doubt he ever left Latvia. If he did, he would have ended in Poland or Auschwitz.
So we have a question from Pessy Kraus. Pessy is one of our viewers in Jerusalem, and quite interestingly says she was born in Leipzig and has put something of her family history into the chat if anybody watching wants to have a look at that. She also says that she was interned on the Isle of Man as a child. She wonders how you discovered so much about your grandparents. Could you speak something about the process of research that you undertook?
It would have been very difficult had it not been for the family chronicle that my father wrote. It was only 20 pages long, but it gave several clues, which as I was able to augment in archives in Bayreuth and in Bamberg to piece together a little more about their family history, about the businesses that they ran, and of course that there is a growing field of research and history in Germany itself. People trying to, I suppose, revive the past, and to do, I suppose, what I also tried to do in the book, which was to restore to my grandparents, that lost generation, some sense of having been here, some sense of dignity, some sense of the identity that the Nazis had stripped from them. And there are some very talented and resourceful researchers in Germany who are very happy to share their findings. But of course, when I talk, as I do extensively about Latvia in the book, very little is known about what happened in Latvia. There are very few histories written those times. And some of them are written by Latvian historians who have something of a vested interest to protect the reputation of their country. And so, although their accounts of what happened can be, I think, pretty reliable, their interpretation of events and who's responsible for them, I think, bears fairly close investigation. But in order to try to understand what my grandparents must have gone through in Latvia, I relied very much on the testimony of survivors in Latvia, many of whom wrote books that almost nobody has read. They deserve to be read. They do illuminate that awful period of history in Latvia, and do, as I'm concerned, illuminate how what my grandparents and indeed my grandmother's brothers and sisters who were also deported at the same time, what they must have gone through. There was also, actually, incidentally, in Bamberg, there was a historian called Karl Misteler, who wrote an extraordinarily well-informed and interesting history of the death of the community, at the end of the Jewish community in Bamberg, and it relied on, to a great extent, on the diary kept by a former chairman of the Jewish community there. So there are all kinds of resources, many of which come across almost by chance on the internet, that did help.
Your accounts, particularly about what happened in Latvia, are extremely graphic. And as you've explained, this is not well known and deserves to be. I wondered what your view was of Latvia's politicians, who seem to be in denial about what happened in the past in their country.
Yes, well, I think we've seen I come back to this idea of challenging kind of orthodoxy. I think we need to think more carefully about, for example, kinder transport. We in this country celebrate as wonderful evidence of the generosity of Britain and its legacy as a place of refuge. And of course, 10,000 young children owed their lives to it, but we shouldn't forget that many hundreds of thousands more perished, and in particular, those children arrived as orphans. Their parents were not allowed to. British government would not allow their parents to come to this country, and very few ever of those families were ever reunited. So, we have a lot, I think, we should be thinking more carefully about, as do the Americans and others. In Latvia, I think we need to understand that it's only been 100 years since Latvia achieved its independence. And in 50 of those 100 years, it's been under the pretty oppressive thumb of successive dictatorships. First the Soviets, then when the Nazis drove them out, the Nazis, and then the Soviets again. And they have a difficult task in engaging with their own history, because they need to find for themselves an identity which they can be proud of, which they can be. And the thought of collaboration with the Nazis in the persecution of Jews in Latvia is very difficult for them to handle. Now, I do understand that for the reasons that I've set out. I'm not sure that you can easily excuse it. In Poland, of course, they have a similar challenge which they're failing to rise to. In fact, it's a civil offence now to hate Poland or Poles in the persecution of Jews in the time of the Nazis. In Lithuania, Hungary, they have similar problems. But sooner or later, it is important that they face up facts of their past. In a way, I believe that the Germans, by and large, have seriously attempted to, and to a large extent, have succeeded in doing. They, in the end, have not hidden their past. And I think they are all the stronger as a democracy for the fact that they have engaged with that past. But I think the Latvians have a way to travel.
Indeed, although there are still large German businesses which were really stolen from Jews, and really in many ways that's not been addressed yet. We have a question from Ruth Baumberg. She's interested to know what your father did when he came to the UK, and how your childhood was, and how and where you were educated.
My father worked most of his career as a translator, a technical translator. Actually started with working at Birmingham University and then Oxford University. And then he worked for Ernst Leitz, the people who make Leica cameras. Photography was a passion of his. He translated many technical books, and even when he retired from Leitz, he continued that work. Many interests, trains, stamps, kind of fairly solitary pastime. He was a quiet, unassuming man. That's the way he had chosen to live. I think looking at the letters he wrote my mother in the 40s when they were newlyweds, and looking back over some of the photographs, he was an only child, and I think he was probably quite outgoing in his childhood and his adolescence. I think probably quite gregarious. He, as many young Germans did, went hiking and canoeing and so on and so forth. Skiing, he was a very keen skier up to the age of 79. But when he came to this country, I think perhaps in light of his experiences in Germany, he just wanted a quiet life. My mother was much more outgoing, quite a dominant personality, a great character, very creative, and a wonderful mother. And our childhood, I think, was a pretty happy childhood. I went to a splendid English prep school and then an independent school. Again, I guess because although my father was on politically left of centre, he just wanted the best that he could afford. They were never particularly well off. He made lots of sacrifices in order to afford the best educations that he could for his children. But I think he was pretty determined that the opportunities that had been denied him would not be denied his children. He would have gone to university, I'm sure, if he'd been able to. He was very interested in science for all his life. He was a young man of great promise, and that promise was stolen from him. So he was determined that would happen to his children.
We have Yvonne Cheney in Southern California interested how long it took you to collate all the facts that were necessary in writing your book.
It took, I guess, about 5 years, perhaps gestation. I mentioned earlier that I'm fairly painstaking in the way that I write, both in order to get my narrative as coherent as I can, to work out my own thinking, but also I mentioned these various different layers that rises, and to get them to work together is quite challenging. And so sometimes I would literally take 6 months off when I felt that I'd written myself to a standstill. Sometimes it does help to take time away from it and then come back with eyes. And also have an ear, I hope, for language. Those who read the book might have a different idea, but I know when a sentence sounds right. I don't want to claim that every sentence in the book sounds right, but it takes me a long time to be satisfied with what I've written. So it did take me time to do the research. It did take me time to figure out where to go from one question to the next. And then finally, I went on 2 trips, 2 pilgrimages, one to Germany and then another to Latvia. And I was very lucky in the timing because I went in 2019. If I'd left it another year, of course, I would have been prevented from doing so by COVID. So that was fortunate. So it was quite a long process, and it probably was, I don't know, 3 years into that 5-year process before I thought, actually, I've got a book here. And then, of course, you have to find yourself an agent and a publisher, and that takes a bit of time. So it was a lengthy process. And it's very nice that somebody from Southern California has joined us. Somebody asked about my education. I spent a year at a university in Los Angeles, very happy here, Occidental College, which Barack Obama went to as a man. But our time didn't overlap, but I'm very happy here in Southern California.
Now, as we have you here, I'm interested to know, as a former Labour MP, what you felt about the rise of Jeremy Corbyn and his impact on the Labour Party.
I mean, I knew Jeremy quite well when I was an MP. We weren't personal friends, but there were 1 or 2 issues on which we worked together. One of which, incidentally, was the restoration of citizenship rights to people of Helena, which was one of my minor triumphs. But anyway, and he was very supportive about that. But he was always, I mean, the interesting thing about Jeremy was that he was always almost a self-conscious outsider. He used to sit in the same position on the furthermost back bench with his little kind of group of friends, John McDonnell and Diane Abbott and all the others that he took with him into the shadow cabinet when he became leader. And I think they were most comfortable up there on the top bench, never on the front bench, always slightly out of step with the rest of the Labour Party, and certainly with the front bench. But he came from a political tradition, you know, an almost ideological tradition, which brings with it some very serious constraints on independent thinking. And I like to think of him as, you know, I'm not interested in whether Jeremy Corbyn was or was not an anti-Semite. You'll never be able to see into the mind of anyone really when they protest that there isn't a racist bone in their body. I think that the charge against Jeremy is that he enabled others to enter the Labour Party who did have some or do have some serious misconceptions about the world. And one of those misconceptions is about the Middle East, and that leads them into confusing anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, and not being able to reflect when people call them to account because of that, as I say, ideological orthodoxy. But you know, Jeremy's not entirely responsible for it. We had exactly the same insinuation of those kinds of far left streams of thought in the 1980s, and it took us 18 years between 1979 and 1997 when I was elected to see them off and get over that reputation. But I think Keir Starmer has done a very good job isolating those kind of far left elements that was so damaging to Labour's credibility and to its reputation, not just in relation to their very primitive views about Jews and Zionism, but also a whole range of other issues. Mm. So, this was not a great moment in Labour Party history, but I do believe that we are putting it behind us now.
We are over time. We could keep talking for a lot longer, I'm sure, but I'm interested to conclude by asking you about your own Judaism. Your parents are Jewish. You are Jewish, as Jewish as you wish to be. I wondered how that manifests itself in your life.
The truth of the matter is that in terms of religion, I have no Judaism at all. I inherited a Chanukiah from my aunt a few years ago, and I like to light the candles at Hanukkah. But I have no knowledge, no learning, Jewish knowledge or learning. So I can't pretend that I have any religious association at all. In terms of, I wouldn't say that I'm a member of the Jewish community either, really. I'm not, but that doesn't mean, in fact, I've written this book, makes very clear that I do consider myself to be Jewish. And this was a kind of bone of contention between me and my father. As I mentioned earlier, he wanted to be anonymous. He didn't want to be picked out. He didn't want to identify as anything out of the ordinary. So he resisted the idea that he was Jewish. Although, you know, I didn't deny it, but he didn't want really to talk about it or to acknowledge it. This was something of a bone of contention because his Jewish heritage was far stronger than my own. But I made the point to him, which is one I still believe in, which is that when you're a member of a minority, particularly when you understand Jewish history, you understand that you do not have the power to define yourself. You know, my grandfather was a Prussian. He was a upstanding middle-class German citizen. He was a veteran of the First World War. He thought he was a German. Ultimately, the Nazis told him he was a Jew. And I know that I'm Jew. I hope I hope I never will face. I believe I will face the kinds of challenges that many people do still face as members of the Jewish community, those who are easily identified as. But I know that I am a Jew. I don't want to say I'm proud of it, because one of the things that my father taught me, which I think is a lesson worth learning, is that you cannot really be proud of anything that you have not yourself achieved. And I think we are, we know the dangers of people who say they're proud to be Germans, or they're proud to be Latvians, or they're proud to be Christians, or they're proud to be Americans. That way often leads, to populism, being seen enough of populism all over the Western world and elsewhere. I think we should say we're lucky to be, we're lucky to be Germans, we're lucky to be Americans, and it's our responsibility for the country or the world that we pass on is the one that we came into. That's our task. That's what previous generations perhaps failed to fulfill. That's the responsibility that falls to us. So I'm Jewish. I'm very content and comfortable to be Jewish. I'm very interested in being Jewish. But that's about as far as it goes.
Well, it's been fascinating to chat to you, Peter. We could talk all night, I'm sure, but we need to wind up. If you'd like to buy a copy of The Last Train, you'll find a link on our website, and it will also be on the email that will send you out tomorrow. Buying the book from Amazon in this way does help to support Milim a little, but the book won't cost you any more. It's also available at all other booksellers. And to say thank you, we'd like to send you a book of some of my photography. This is the Israeli Ambulance Service in action, so we hope you'll enjoy having a flick through that. Now, a few words about our upcoming programme before we leave you. Next week, on the 19th of December, we have Craig Sherman. He'll be joining us from New Jersey to chat about his novel, No Good Deed. This will be our last presentation of the year and is essential reading for any aspiring synagogue president. He should be a very interesting guest. More is in the pipeline. We expect a busy programme next year, so visit milim.org.uk, sign up to our newsletter, and that way you'll be sure not to miss anything. All our events are free, but you can make a small donation to help with the cost of putting on these events. There is a link in the chat now, or visit our website. It remains for me to thank our guest, Peter Bradley, once again. Thank you so much, Peter.
Not at all. Thank you.
And looking forward to seeing you all again as a future event. Until then, stay safe. See you soon.